Well, hey, it's Matt Steen here again with another chemistry conversation. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Bob Logan. So, Bob has over 40 years of ministry experience. He has pastored, he has planted churches, and he's spent a lot of time equipping leaders. He's a guy who I became familiar with through his blog, several years ago, and there's a ton of great stuff there. We'll link off to it below. But he's also an author. He's written The Discipleship Difference, The Leadership Difference, and the church planting journey, and just has really poured into a ton of great leaders through the years and really helped them figure out, how to do discipleship well in the church. So, Bob, thanks for taking some time to talk.
Hey, it's good to be with you, Matt.
Yeah. So Bob, we typically somehow in 10-ish minutes, we really just kind of go into three different questions. So tell me a little bit. I mean, right now, as you're surveying the landscape of the church world, what are you learning about the church?
I'm really learning, Matt, that we have an opportunity to return to our roots.
Oh.
And I think that the chaos of what we're experiencing right now has sort of shaken us up a lot. And in some ways, I think we may be discovering that we've kind of lost our first love. And so I think God is calling us back to our connection with Him. And as we connect with God and experience Him, we can experience that kind of authentic transformation.
Yeah.
And calling us back also to those kind of relationships that are truly supportive and encouraging, sort of in that Hebrews 10:23-25 kind of sense of considering how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. And through that kind of supportive environment, then re-engaging the mission of Jesus in the world.
So that's fascinating. So go back a little bit and unpack. You said, we feel like we've lost our first love. Unpack that. What are you seeing? What are we replacing that with in your estimation?
Well, many, many things, mostly activity, trying to do these kinds of actions like conducting worship services or trying to figure out how to go online and handle the digital challenges. And so just lots of distractions, I would say, and getting so busy trying to do the work for God, we forget the worship of God. Yeah. And that personal connection in that way. So I think that's the critical issue is how do you see God at work in everyday life? One of the things that I do in the groups that I'm involved in is we always light a candle to begin reminding ourselves that Jesus is the light of the world and His presence is promised through the indwelling Holy Spirit. Yeah. And after we light that candle, then the first question we always ask is, how did you experience God this week? And I've discovered that as you ask that question week after week after week, you begin to see God's involvement in your own life and in the lives of those around you far more than you were previously aware. And so I think part of that is just that perspective of awareness and sensitivity to God, and then responding in that more personal, intimate kind of way. That's what I mean by the first love, that going back to those roots.
Yeah. So you work with a ton of leaders, and I'm sure, once or twice you come across somebody who asks that question and they just kind of scratch their head and they're sitting there thinking, I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how I've seen God move. I don't know when the last getting so caught up in the busyness and of doing ministry. How do you coach people in that situation, to return to that first love?
Well, I think part of it is just awareness.
Yeah.
And so if you're aware that you don't really have an answer to that question, how did you experience God this week? Yeah. That is saying something, which means you're either moving too fast or you're not taking time to reflect. And so sometimes that just knowing that question is going to be asked then increases your awareness, and you start saying, oh my goodness, how did I see God at work? Yeah. And then when you start seeing it, it's also, pretty amazing. I go to a barbershop and it's an African-American barbershop and really kind of cool place. And one of the other barbers there is now starting to get interested in biking.
Mm.
And I was just thinking and had a sense of prompting from the Lord that, I should see if this guy wants to go riding with me sometime. And yet the last couple times I was there, he wasn't in the shop. So yesterday I rode my bike out to have lunch with a friend in a place that was about 20 miles from my house. And lo and behold, the guy walks by down the street.
Yeah.
I saw him.
Yeah.
And then had lunch with my friend. And then later on, I was riding back home, and lo and behold, I saw him again in his car at an intersection. Mm. And yet there was one more time that I saw him. And so it's like, that was God. I don't know exactly what he's up to there, but the connection there that was there. And it's like, when you start opening yourselves up to that sort of thing, you see that sort of thing. It's kind of cool and exciting.
Yeah. That's cool. That's cool. So that's cool that you get into that rhythm and you get into that habit of regularly asking the question, or having somebody ask you the question, knowing that it's coming. How about for somebody who's just dry? I mean, we've been through a tough season, and this, bear with me because I know these aren't the questions I asked you, but you kind of poked something. We're coming through a pretty bumpy season for a lot of church leaders. A lot of us are kind of beat up and a little bit bruised coming through this. Some of us are just kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel as far as, our own, spiritual wherewithal. How do you encourage somebody in that situation and how do you walk with them to begin to re-energize their faith? Is that I don't know that I like that phrase, but I think that fits.
Well, I think the question is how can you create some space to be able to just be still and listen to God.
Yeah.
For me, one of the ways I do that is through my cycling, and I bicycle, and that gives me plenty of chance to unplug. The other way you can work with some folks is ask them, well, what do you already do? And maybe you drop your kid off at school and then swing by a Starbucks or your favorite coffee place.
Yeah.
Well, could you then just add to that routine just to sit down and just spend a few minutes to reflect upon God and sort of talk to God or listen to God and say, what do you have for me today that's important? So I think that if you can kind of link it to something else, that's a helpful thing as a first step. Sometimes just having a conversation with a friend. That you already have a connection with that friend on a regular basis. You could just say, hey, would you mind asking me this one question each week? And that's a way to do it. So I think sometimes, Matt, we try and force a lot of stuff to happen as opposed to saying, what's the natural rhythm? What's the natural flow? And then how could we incorporate something that just puts that little extra spin on it that maybe creates enough space for God to deal with us.
Keep it simple, but just be doing it. That's great. So you started off talking how we have, just this great opportunity in front of us to return to our first love and lean into this. As you look at the season in front of us, what are you seeing as some of the greatest opportunities that our church, our pastors have to really lean into that in the season ahead?
Well, I think the biggest one is to go back to the basics.
Yeah.
And Jesus said to love God, love others as you love yourself. Mm-hmm. And then he told us to make disciples. Mm-hmm. And so I think it really is that simple. How do we connect with God? Mm-hmm. How do we serve and connect with others? Mm-hmm. And then as we're doing that, just living as God's kingdom people, then keeping our eyes and ears open for what is God already doing in the lives of other people. Yeah. And then how can we join with what God is already doing? Yeah. I heard yesterday, I have no idea where the quote came from, but that effectiveness is really just engaging in the conversation that God is already having with somebody else.
That's good.
in the sense of God is already working. He's already actively involved. And so we just need to see what God is up to. And in the words of Henry Backleby, join God in that.
Yeah, that's strong. And so as you look at this season, and with the guys that you're coaching, I mean, how do you see them leading into this and really jumping into that conversation? Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no worries. I think the key thing is that so we've confused the method with the mission.
Ooh.
And so, in these chaotic times that we're in, everybody's trying to figure out how to do worship service. Yep. And worship service is very important, but it's only one of the many means toward the ultimate mission that God has given us to make disciples.
Right.
One of the curious things, Matt, that I have been doing with people, I said, what if this current situation, this COVID era that we're in, continues for another 5 years?
Ooh.
And I'm not trying to be a pessimist, nor am I being prophetic on that sort of thing. But I said, if it were to go on indefinitely, what would you start doing differently now?
Yeah.
And without exception, people would say, well, they'd think for quite a while, but then they would say, we'd start discipling parents on how to disciple their own kids. We would help people to begin to see how they could be the hands and feet and voice of Jesus in their own particular context.
Yeah.
And they are getting back to that notion of how do we live as disciples? How do we make disciples? How do we be God's kingdom people right where we are? And I thought, now that's curious. That what we really, that's the real focus that we should have. And of course, disciples want to gather together and worship God and have all those wonderful times together that God intends for us. But that's the core thing. And our mission has not been stopped by a virus. And yet that's the core thing, I think, to get back onto the mission, and then recognize that our methods need to adjust in accordance to the context and challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, that's great. I think the mentoring and the families is so huge, because I think one of the things, and you may have heard this, but I feel like a lot of the churches we've been working with, one of the common refrains that we've been hearing is that the young families are the ones that have pulled out and have been the slowest to re-engage over the last, but still wanting to find a way to be able to care for their families and that kind of thing. But they've, for one reason or another, are the ones that haven't done that. And so being able to kind of pour into them is huge as they care for their kids, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the fact of the matter is that they may have very legitimate reasons for pulling out.
Yeah.
And yet that doesn't negate the responsibility that they have to disciple their kids. So how do you come alongside of them to help them in that process? That's an adjustment of approach that would be very helpful in this journey.
Yeah, that's great. So as you talk to church leaders as they're kind of leaning into this next season, what encouragement are you giving them as they go about ministry, as they go about doing ministry in a sustainable way, not just for their church, but for themselves and their family as well?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say refuse the burden of distraction.
Ooh.
To embrace serenity by asking God, what can I do?
Yeah.
And then do it. I like the serenity prayer, and we're all familiar with the first part of it, but I'm not sure we've heard the entire one very recently. I'd like to read it to you.
Okay.
God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he'll make all things right if I surrender to his will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever and ever in the next. Amen.
Amen. May it be. So, well, Bob, thank you so much for that and for just spending some time with us today. I really greatly appreciate it. If you want to learn more about Bob and what he's up to, you can go to loganleadership.com. We'll link off to that down below as well to his blog and his recent book, Discipleship Difference. The other thing is, and you shared a little bit about this with me before we talked, but you are getting ready to gather a cohort of students for a Doctor of Ministry cohort at Fuller, focusing on leading for healthy growth. Do you mind telling us a little bit about what that looks like? And we'll link off to that as well.
Yeah, sure. It's actually a 3-year cohort,
Mm.
and Leading for Healthy Growth is the title. We focus the first year on missional discipleship, some of these core themes that we've talked about, and then effective leadership, and then the ministry systems, and coming out of that whole thing, you're basically starting from the harvest all the way to living and loving like Jesus, making disciples, starting multiplying groups, raising up leaders, dealing with the organizational change and your own leadership as you grow, ultimately leading to multiplication.
Yeah.
And the goal of that would have you develop a plan for healthy development, to really live out God's kingdom in your own ministry context. So I love the opportunity to come alongside of leaders, and it would be a great time to journey together. So the main thing is that the applications for that need to be in by this fall, because we're going to start in the spring of 2022.
Great. Well, there you go. You've got a little bit of time to be able to sign up for that. And like I said, we'll link off to that down below. But Bob, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the way that you care for pastors and churches, and just grateful that you're sharing your wisdom with us today.
Privilege to be with you, Matt. Thanks so much.